Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Chapter 16, Research, Development, and the Future.
Psychological warfare is part of civilization. Civilization, no matter how one defines it, is not a static thing. It is an immense fermenting, active, often turbulent composite of the whys and hows of the way men and women think and behave. The short-run factors in a civilization are often as important as the long-run ones. Though the United States from 1860 to 1960 has been a steady part of the West European, predominantly Christian civilization, the United States has undergone immense changes of fashion, belief, appetite, preference, and behavior. With any changing, developing civilization, war may seem like a very static term, so that the Civil War and the War of the Western Powers against Germany of 1939 to 45 may to some degree seem comparable phenomena. They are comparable, but only within sharp limits. The meaning of war. Nowhere is the transitoriness and changeability of modern civilization more evident than in the significance which intelligent men and women attach to the term war. War was noble in 1861 to 65, but in 1941 to 45 it was noble only for the most perfunctory and most hollow oratory. Push the contrast farther. Psychological warfare was an unknown element in 1861 to 65. By 1941 to 45, it had become fashionable. One can seriously doubt that President Lincoln ever worried about Northern citizens becoming un-American under that rubric, though he had plenty of traitors to worry him. The years 1945 to 53 were momentous. A whole string of new ideas, new terms, and new behavior patterns appeared within the USA in a mere 8 years. What the next 20 years will bring is deeply uncertain. War is coming to mean the effectuation or prevention of revolution, not the half-savage, half-courteous armed conflict of sovereign nations. War is getting to be chronic again. War between entirely comparable states such as the United States and Canada, Mexico and Cuba, Indonesia and India, Iraq and Saudi Arabia, or any similar combination is getting to be more and more unthinkable. War between ideologically dissimilar states such as North Korea and South Korea, Communist China and Nationalist China, Viet Minh and Vietnam, USSR and USA, is getting to be virtual normality. Research into tension. It is true of all people that they solve particular problems, in many cases, sometime after the occasion for solving the problem has passed. What is called decision in government, politics, and in personal affairs is very often not the selection of one very real course of action as against another equally real course of action, but the confirmation of a commitment already made. If this is true of everyday life, it is even more true of scholars and experts. One of the disabilities of our time in the field of the social and psychological sciences and the humanities lies in the fact that, although government officials recognize problems some months or years after they have arisen and finally attempt to deal with them, scholars frequently get around problems decades after any practical occasion for decision has passed. Nowhere is this more evident than in the discussion of tensions as a cause of war. Tension certainly contributed very much to the outbreak of war in 1914. It is possible that the tensions and hostilities of Europe in the 1930s, which allowed fascism and communism to become threatening and powerful, also contributed in the end to the outbreak of war in 1939. It is difficult, however, to suppose that the coming of war in September 1939 was itself the result of tension, except as a very remote and indirect cause. This author believes that tension leads to a perpetuation of a kind of civilization in which wars are possible, but cannot persuade himself that an additional factor of tension within civilization as we know it can be an immediate cause of war. Research into tensions has been carried fairly far. It may be that the wartime role of tension can be ascertained by scientific methods, so that the psychological warfare of Power A can cause so much more tension than Power B, either among the elite or among the general population, that Power B cannot further continue the war. Alternatively, it is imaginable that Power A may be able to relax tension so sharply among the elite or broad population of Power B that Power B's potentiality for war, or decision to wage war, can be postponed. For purposes of research, it seems worthwhile to suggest that tension appears to be highly prevalent in the two most powerful military civilizations on Earth today, the USSR and its satellites on the one hand, and the cluster of Western powers on the other. Tension appears to be caused by the complexity of everyday life, the demands made upon the psychophysiological organization of each individual human being, by the technological facilities available, and through the relief offered within each civilization by the opportunity to discharge hatred against members of the other civilization instead of recognizing self-hatred for the very real problem which it is. In other terms, it is tough to be modern. The difficulty of being modern makes it easy for individuals to be restless and anxious. Restlessness and anxiety lead to fear. Fear converts freely into hate. Hate very easily takes on political form. Political hate assists in the creation of real threats such as the atomic bomb and guided missiles, which are not imaginary threats at all. The reality of the threats seems to confirm the reality of the hate which led to it, thus perpetuating a cycle of insecurity, fear, hate, armament, insecurity, fear, and on around the circle again and again. Revolutionary possibilities in psychology. It is possible, but by no means probable, that the rapid development of psychological and related sciences in the Western world may provide whole new answers to the threats which surround modern Americans, including the supreme answer of peace as an alternative to war, or the secondary answer of victory in the event of war. Nothing in the existing academic literature on the subject of psychology of war, the psychiatry of modern mass behavior, the psychology or psychiatry of present-day power politics, justifies the inference that an applicable solution to our problems is at all near. The problems are almost all aspects of our entire lives, and one cannot solve life like a Delphic riddle or a single scientific experiment. It would be unwise of U.S. military and political leaders to overlook developing strengths within American everyday talk and thinking, whether academic or popular. Too specific a concentration on the problem of winning a war may cause a leader or his expert consultants to concentrate on solutions derived from past experience, therewith leading him to miss new and different solutions which might be offered by his own time. Changes need not always be thought of as weaknesses, which they are if past criteria are retained as absolute standards. Men born in the period 1910 to 20th may have endowments which are not commonly found among men born in the period 1930 to 40. Yet it is entirely possible that the generation born during 1930 to 40 may have capacities and resistances which the older generation does not altogether appreciate. Apply this concept to communism. Communism loses strength every day that it exists. Each day deprives it of novelty. Each day makes it a littler more familiar. Each day makes its leaders one day older. If Americans can learn how to be flexible and imaginative and to understand themselves as they really are, they might find that the real American appeal to the youth of the world would be much greater than the communist appeal. It was unfortunately characteristic of the United States in the early 1950s of the Cold War that U.S. propaganda was based on ideals and standards older than the ideals and standards competitively presented by the communists, and that therefore in many parts of the world the struggle between Americans and communists appeared to be a struggle on our side of the old against the young. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The United States Army in Korea in 1950 to 53 was one of the most revolutionary armies in history, an army dedicated to non-victory, pledging allegiance to a shadowy world government of the United Nations behind the practical reality of the government of the United States. Perhaps never before in many centuries have men fought so matter-of-factly, so calmly, so reasonably. They fought well and did not need to be jazzed up with the hashish of making the world safe for democracy or establishing the four freedoms. The temper of the U.S. forces in Korea in 1951 was demonstrated by a reserve sergeant who scarcely knew he was in the reserves until he was on a boat bound for Busan. He was a practical man, anxious to get home, but willing to do his share in this war as long as he had to. He was given the assignment of testing the voice plane of U.S. headquarters at Daegu. The loudspeaker was not working quite right, and he was instructed to test the plane at 500, 1,000 and 1,500 feet. The plane flew low over U.S. headquarters. The roar of the engines almost deafened everyone within the building. Yet even above the roar of the engines, there could be heard the bone-chilling hum of the silent loudspeaker, an immense magnification of the noise one hears from a radio set which is turned on without being tuned to a station. Everyone expected the sergeant to say, "This is the USAC voice plane testing. 1A, 2A, 3A." Instead, the immense voice came through clearly, through brick and plaster and wood, through air and trees. It must have reached 4 miles. The gigantic voice of the sergeant seemed to roar over half of South Korea as he said, "Why don't you imperialist sons o' bitches go back to Wall Street where you belong?" It was said that 50 colonels grabbed for their phones simultaneously, but the purely American gimmick to the whole story lay in the fact that the sergeant was not punished. No damage was done. The Americans thought their enemies were funny or silly. We had shown that we were not afraid of communist ideas. Several South Koreans told the author that they regarded the Americans as inscrutable people indeed. The development of modern civilization is certain to have developments in war, both as to the purpose of war and as to the modes of war. It seems likely that in the face of the supreme danger of atomic and thermonuclear weapons, nations will resort more and more to small wars and semi-war operations, which will offer the opportunity of strategic advantage without the cataclysmic danger of a worldwide showdown. In a very hush-hush way, the U.S. Army is looking into the possibilities of small and irregular kinds of war. Security regulations prohibit the author from discussing some of the interesting new developments in this field. National Research and Development Programs. The United States government, considered as a whole, has developed a very adequate scientific research program. Most of this is quite properly keyed to the physical and mechanical sciences, in which the most tangible results are obtained. Substantial strides are being made in the medical and allied fields. Some research is, however, being carried out in fields pertaining to psychological warfare. These are worth describing, but it must be remembered that research on psy-war may not affect psy-war itself as much as research in other fields which, by changing the character of war, will change psy-war too. Within the general research field, 2 basic approaches have been recognized by the U.S. Army as being distinct from one another: developmental research and operations research. Developmental research consists of that research which creates new weapons, new methods of war, new devices or procedures, doing so by digging through modern science, investigating its applicability to military problems, and then advancing the frontier of science, when necessary, in the military interest. The goals of operations research are more modest and, in some respect, more provocative. Operations research takes operations as they exist and re-examines them from beginning to end to discover how much of each operation is scientifically pertinent to its stated goal, what economies, modifications, or changes might be introduced, and how the operation might be improved. Developmental research in psy-war. At the time of the close of the 1950-53 phase of Korean hostilities, the psy-war being conducted by the United States Army in Korea showed little sign of having been influenced by developmental research into this field of activity. The leaflets were not better than the leaflets of World War II, nor even very different. Because of the peculiar political limitations of the war, the radio program was not as good as the performance of APSI under Eisenhower. The tactical use of loudspeakers had shown a very marked improvement over World War II standards, but to a non-engineer such as the present writer, neither the communist loudspeakers nor our own seemed strikingly better or different. Developmental research had a great deal to offer, but the gap between initial scientific advance and practical military application appeared to be too broad to warrant the assumption that the research had transformed the U.S. psy-war program. Operations research in Korea. Operations research, sometimes slangily called OpSearch, was applied to the Korean War with highly uneven results. Among other things, Army officers in the psy-war field showed, early in the Korean War, that land forces possessed tactical opportunities which combat propaganda could exploit very effectually. Various experiments were tried, none of them so decisive as to affect the outcome of the war, but some of them of real tactical value and others of great importance in obtaining Chinese prisoners. One of the points examined was surrender as a process. Surrendering does not depend upon the disposition of the individual enemy soldier to say yes or no to the war as a whole. He could say no 1,000 times and still be on the other side shooting at us. The actual physical process of surrender is an elaborate one, consisting of the psychological processes of getting ready to give up on the other side, the physical capacity to surrender when the opportunity for getting captured presents itself, and the alternative, more difficult process of deliberately leaving the other side and getting to our side alive. In 1951 and 1952, there were considerable developments along this line. Americans learned much about how to teach enemy soldiers to surrender. Late in 1952 and early in 1953, the front had become so static that it took extraordinary heroism for soldiers outside of a tiny minority engaged in reconnaissance patrols to get away from their own side and surrender to the enemy without being killed by their friends as deserters or by the enemy as sneak attackers. The U.S. public did not realize that throughout the Korean War, the Communists, Russian, North Korean, and Chinese enjoyed a distinct radio advantage over the UN side, both as to funds available for programs and as to number of station hours on the air. The language gap between the Americans and Chinese was so extreme that it was hard for Americans to realize that the Chinese broadcasts covered wider audiences and covered them better than did our own. American restraint in this field may have been dictated in part by the fact that the war was a limited war, consisting of combat only with those armed Chinese communists on North Korean territory, but not with armed Chinese communists elsewhere in the Far East. Philosophy and propaganda development. In terms of specific literature of psy-war, it is difficult to find many contributions of professional philosophers to psy-war since the end of World War II. This is curious, in view of the communist propagation of philosophy, no matter how perverted its form, as a major weapon. The American philosopher, Dr. George Morgan, who became a career diplomat, was simultaneously a Soviet-area expert and a key figure in the Psychological Strategy Board. There were not many others like him. Philosophy offers an opportunity for the re-examination of cultural values. The indoctrination of those professors who will teach the teachers of the generation after next will influence the capacity of future Americans to have a worldview which will give them the utmost opportunities for action in the military field, while retaining as far as possible the blessings of U.S. civilian civilization. That U.S. civilization is still civilian and not military is, of course, beyond cavil. The William Jackson Committee was a voice crying in the wilderness when it asked for new terms and new ideas against which to set U.S. propaganda operations in the world of modern strategy. Philosophers may have had the capacity for finding some of the answers, but philosophers of all people do not like to be jostled or hurried. The author has never heard of a philosopher employed on a confidential basis by the United States government to think through the historical and cultural rationale of a U.S. military victory for the future. Writers such as F.S.C. Northrop and Erich Fromm, to name only two sharply contrasting personalities, have written books which possess high significance for the international propaganda field. The connection appears, however, to be tangential. Literary contributions. Almost all the best propagandists of almost all modern powers have been, to a greater or less degree, literary personalities. The artistic and cultural aspect of writing is readily converted to propaganda usage. Elmer Davis is a novelist as well as a commentator. Robert Sherwood is one of America's most distinguished playwrights. Benito Mussolini wrote a bad novel. Mao Zedong is a poet and philosopher as well as a Communist Party boss. Down among the workers in the field, such American novelists as James Gould Cozzens, Pat Frank, Jerome Weidman, and Murray Dyer have worked on U.S. psychological warfare. Though literary men have converted their writing to propaganda purposes, few of them have gone on to define the characteristics of a specific conversionary literature or to compile canons of literary style applicable to the propaganda field. The contributions may lie in the future. The social sciences. The American Association of Public Opinion Research, AAOPR, is the professional league of U.S. propagandists and analysts of public opinion. Its quarterly Public Opinion is the key journal in the field. The members of this association are drawn both from the social sciences and from the psychological sciences, ranging from such practical operatives as Dr. George Gallup and Elmo Roper to austere theorists like Professors Nathan Lights and Hadley Cantrell. A good argument can be presented to the effect that the skills brought from the social science into the propaganda field are more valuable once they are employed full-time in that field than an attempt to apply political science or sociology or economics, each as an individual compartment, to the field of propaganda. There is still no book available with the title The Politics of Knowledge, even though the reception, control, prohibition, and dissemination of knowledge is a major factor in all modern governmental processes both in and out of the propaganda field. Psychology and related sciences. There has been an immense amount of work done by psychologists, much of it classified, on the field of propaganda. Some of this work is refreshing in the extreme and should provide nasty surprises for the communists in a major war. Other parts are restatements which, if translated into operations, might or might not prove feasible with the kind of army we Americans have or are likely to have. One of the most conspicuous developments since World War II has been the application by psychologists, sociologists, and persons in related field of quantifying techniques. The introduction of rigorous scientific requirements of number into the attempted reportage of propaganda behavior or propaganda results is having a significant effect. Quantification may not obtain everything which its devotees claim for it. There is a wide area of human behavior which is significant to the ordinary person, or even to the expert in descriptive terms, and which loses much of its significance if the descriptive and elusive terms are replaced by measurements, tables, and graphs. There is, however, no danger that quantification will replace description as the sole tool of research in the propaganda field. What quantification does do is develop a common area of discussion between propagandists and non-propagandists. In many instances, quantification can demonstrate results where allegations of failure or of success would have nothing more than personal authority to support them. Within our own particular kind of civilization, quantification has a special appeal because of the American trust in engineering and in numbers. The conclusions of the Kinsey reports on men and on women seem much more authoritative to the ordinary man because they are presented with an ample garniture of numbers, even though Havelock Ellis's pioneer works in the psychology and behavior patterns of Western sex life may have been much more tangible and much more revolutionary in their time. Projection and research. All propaganda involves a certain degree of projection. The propagandist attempts to identify himself with a situation which he does not face in real life, and to issue meaningful communications to persons about situations which they themselves do not face yet. Much of the psychological research on tactical psy-war remains yet to be done, although from the quantitative point of view, there have been significant U.S. achievements within the past 4 years. Another aspect of projection is left unexplored because of its immense difficulty and its dangerously unscientific character. Consider the problem this way. The United States, one day before the outbreak of war with a hypothetical enemy such as the Soviet Union, will possess a certain group of characteristics. Representative individual lives within this country can be determined to possess certain habits concerning mass communication, trust in mass communication, and response to symbols which may come through press, radio, or other mass devices. One day after the outbreak of war, the United States will change because the war has broken out. 1 month after the outbreak of war, the United States will no longer be the USA which existed on war day. It may well have become USA because of the rapidity and variety of change. 3 Soviet hydrogen bombs and 12 Soviet atomic bombs might change many of our national, economic, political, and psychological characteristics, and no one, not even an American, could predict this change in advance. The best he could do would be to get ready to study the change as it occurred, to understand the rate and direction of the change, and to assess the meaning of the change in light of the conduct of war. The same would be true of the USSR. That country, like any other major country, would change under the impact of war. Who could have predicted the renaissance of Russian patriotism and traditionalism resulting from the Nazi invasion of 1941? Even if we know where the Russians are as of the outbreak of war, we won't know where they will head or how fast they will head there once war has broken out. The scientific problem presented by attempted serious study of a US-Soviet war is therefore very difficult indeed. It is really a problem involving three clusters of moving bodies. The first cluster will be the American people, their behavior, and their institutions. The second cluster, the Russians and Allied peoples, their behavior and their institutions. The third cluster, the changing methods of communication existing between them. It can be said even now, simply by referring to the character of the American people and their past history, that if the communist leaders of the USSR start a general war, the end of that war is sure, under sets of words and ideas which have yet to be developed in the future, to involve the reconciliation of the inhabitants of the USA with the Russian people. In other words, USA and USSR can and must have certain relationships with each other, preeminent among which are attempts at undoing war damage, at political and cultural reconciliation, and the undertaking of the rebuilding of a world which both these great peoples can support with enthusiasm and hope. USA and USSR are imaginable. USA and USSR for the day preceding the outbreak of war, or alternatively, the day on which the war occurs, will be known elements. American science in many fields can help U.S. mass communications and therewith help our armed forces if we learn how to ascertain how the Soviet leadership changes, how Soviet elite groups change, and how the Soviet population changes during the course of the war. We must not only be able to guess what is happening to them physically, but must try to appreciate and to understand what is happening to them psychologically and semantically. This is an immense task. It is by no means certain that our research and development facilities can give us an adequate research program to handle the problem. This much can be said. If the Americans understand the Russians before the war and during the war, it will be the first time that a nation has kept its enemy in wide-awake sight. The usual process in the past has been the acceptance of a few exaggerated stereotypes of the national characteristics of the potential enemy, the ascription of every possible kind of infamy and inhuman characteristic to the enemy during the war, and the redefinition of the enemy as a friend after the war. It would be strange and wonderful if the U.S. government and the U.S. propagandists, or conceivably as much as a large minority of the U.S. population, could learn how to fight the USSR in order to help the Russians escape from a tyranny which has already hurt them much more than it has hurt us. The Germans suffered a tragic, overwhelming, and perhaps decisive psychological defeat in the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic and in the Ukraine, when they carried with their field forces such naive and tragic Nazi misconceptions of Russian and Ukrainian character as to defeat every opportunity they may have had for a serious anti-communist alliance of Germany with the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. They destroyed themselves, not through ignorance, but through what they thought they knew. If they had been more calm, less assured, more willing to learn from immediate experience, and less indoctrinated with their own preposterous misconceptions of Russian and Ukrainian character, they might have found Russian and Ukrainian allies who would have joined them in the final extermination of the Soviet system. The world communist movement has already suffered very serious setbacks because of its failure to project U.S. behavior successfully from the summer of 1950 onward. If the Russian and Chinese communists had understood Americans well and had made a correct evaluation of the American response to the invasion of South Korea, they would not have driven the United States from lethargy to alertness, from weakness to military strength, from vulnerability toward communist and crypto-communist propaganda to sharp and angry recognition of communist manipulation of symbols such as progressives, people's governments, and liberation. Communist developments. If the U.S. government agencies know about the scientific development of Soviet propaganda techniques in the last few years, they have certainly not told this author. What is here presented is therefore derived from first-hand interrogation of communists, from escapers in both Europe and Asia, and unclassified materials. Sociologically, it would seem that the Russian communists attempted definite improvements of the techniques of communist revolution, and that these improvements have in large part failed in the European satellites. The governments of Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany have turned out to be poor governments, despite the fact that from the Soviet point of view it was a sharp innovation to leave them in pseudo-parliamentary form instead of creating outright Soviet facsimiles. At the Chinese end of the Moscow-Peking axis, the sociology of revolutionary propaganda and organization appears to have worked out much more successfully than at the Russian end. The Chinese communists, perhaps because they were Chinese, perhaps because they were tougher and more experienced communists than the Russians, got their country under rigid control and then undertook social and political experiments on a very audacious scale. They have managed not to be un-Chinese while creating in China the kind of pervasive dictatorship which communist control appears to require. In the manipulation of satellites and in particularization of propaganda, the North Korean Communist Army, the Viet Minh Army in Indochina, and the Malayan Races Liberation Army on the Malay Peninsula appear to have near optimum localism and particularism without suffering serious deviation from the main communist worldwide pattern. In North Korea, of course, Chinese intervention and Soviet support have sharply modified the position of the North Korean People's Army, but the Annamite and Malay communist forces appear to be fighting with high morale and considerable success, despite the duality of control from Peking and Moscow, and despite the difficulties of reconciling Asian nationalism with Marxian world doctrine. Another communist technique is now known through Edward Hunter's provocative pioneer book by its correct name of brainwashing. This involves the transformation of a human personality. The author has himself interrogated victims of brainwashing and can attest to the terrifying depth to which this process is carried. The victim of brainwashing is subject to very slight persuasion at the rational level. He is not even given much propaganda as U.S. propagandists of recent years might recognize the product. Instead, the process of brainwashing consists of a frontal attack on all levels of the personality, from the most conscious to the most hidden. The communists seek through fatigue and sustained interrogation to create a condition similar to what is called nervous breakdown in popular parlance. Then they rebuild the personality, healing their victim into communist normality. One victim to whom the author talked had been so subject to communist brain changing that he thought himself a real communist, even though he had been reared a Catholic. He was completely convinced of the communist cause and of his own life and place in that cause after the brainwashing had been completed. Unfortunately for communism, the man got into serious sexual difficulties. Difficulties of a kind which any American psychiatrist would recognize as potentially devastating. As a result of his sexual frustrations, he suffered a mild equivalent of the medically recognized phenomenon of the schizophrenic break, that terrible moment of false enlightenment in which the psychotic personality cuts loose with a truth of his own and shuts off most or all communication with normal people, with the consequence that he was walking along Nanking Road in Shanghai, a normal communist in one instant of time, and as he put it to the author, in a millionth of a second, he suddenly realized he was a Catholic, an anti-communist, the enemy of every man, woman, and child in sight, and at war with his entire environment. As this writer understood it, the poor man, though adjusted to the communist environment after brainwashing, happened to go crazy enough to come back to our side. Who can say which is sane, which insane? When two social and cultural systems are completely at odds with one another, it may be impossible to be normal in both of them. Scientifically, the Chinese process of personality transformation lacked some of the pharmaceutical features apparent in the Western communist conversions for purposes of confession. It appears to be a combination of audacious practical experimentation with well-known procedures from textbooks of Pavlovian psychology. It is, of course, an interesting scientific question to ask oneself. Could communist psychological researchers do enough psychological research to understand their own difficulties and to decommunize themselves in the very act of seeking better psychological weapons for communism? If the people in charge of communist psychological techniques were scientists, as American psychologists generally are, there might be a real point of discussion. Unfortunately, most of them appear to be artists, believers, and fanatics. The history of the fanatical religions which have inflamed and ripped so much of mankind across the centuries is not such as to suggest that communism will decommunize itself by becoming more communistic or more scientific. Logically considered, the United States remains the largest extant revolutionary experiment in the world, the first immense human community which survives without profound dogma or profound hatred, and which attempts to make short-range, practical, and warm-hearted, though ideologically superficial, concurrence the foundation for a political and industrial civilization. If the United States wins a few more wars, it may be that the rest of mankind will be persuaded that our kind of practicality is not only humanly preferable, but scientifically more defensible than the philosophies of competing civilizations. It seems unlikely that communist research can outstrip us in the propaganda field so far as the race is run in purely scientific terms. Artistically and gadget-wise, the communists are just as inventive as we are, and often more enthusiastic. Private psy-war and covert techniques. Another aspect in the development of psy-war was the inevitable possibility that skills learned in wartime would not be forgotten in time of peace. Many of the background studies made for WWII during World War II have been developed, on the constructive side, into serious scientific contributions to ethnology, anthropology, or psychology. The post-war studies of RAND Corporation have in part been released in unclassified form and add to our knowledge not only of propaganda, but of mankind. The Radier Project at Stanford University, the Russian research program at MIT and Harvard, and other governmentally inspired or encouraged undertakings have borne similar fruit for private scholarship and discussion. On the other side of the coin, it is very hopeful to note that the many and dangerous techniques developed by OSS for covert propaganda, some of which were applied with considerable success in Europe, have not been introduced into domestic U.S. politics, commercial competition, or other forms of private life. After each war, there is often a danger that the coarsening of a culture by the war will lead to the application of wartime skills to peacetime situations. This was emphatically not the case in the presidential campaigns of 1948 and 1952, even though persons of rich psy-war experience in World War II were on the staffs of both Stevenson and Eisenhower. It is often forgotten that some of the deadliest and most effective revolutionary enterprises in the 19th century were undertaken without the consent or assistance of the existing governments. Karl Marx was certainly not an invention of Lord Palmerston. Bakunin did not operate out of the French Foreign Office. In the post-war discussion of USA communist rivalry, recommendations were often made on the U.S. side that we should counter Soviet covert operations with our own covert operations against the USSR. What has been forgotten in this context is the fact that such operations have been made illegal and dangerous under United States law. Under federal law as it exists today, no underground railway could be developed to assist Soviet escapers in the way that Negro slaves were relayed across the free states to Canada in the years before emancipation. One of the chief blocks to U.S. covert operations is the immense growth in all directions of the power, authority, and responsibility of the federal government. This growth makes it almost impossible to wage revolutionary or conspiratorial operations from U.S. territory without the prior approval of U.S. authorities, which the authorities under traditional international law cannot give and cannot afford to give. It would seem desirable, if the Cold War situation persists over a long period of time, for Americans to re-examine the restraints which they have placed upon their own citizens and to attempt a revision of the laws which would permit pro-American secret activities to be launched without permitting anti-American activities of the same kind to be carried on. One immediately comes to the conundrum. How can the government say yes to the one and no to the other without being cognizant of what happens? The answer would appear to lie in the older body of our law, in that a withdrawal of governmental authority from some fields would leave the individual responsible and subject to indictment and trial if his enterprises should prove deleterious to the United States government, but not subject to punishment if his enterprises hurt the known antagonists of the USA. Phrased in another way, this means that the USA might, in a long-range Cold War situation, be required to make some domestic recognition of the fact that the communist states are the antagonists but not the military enemies of the U.S. system of government, and that as antagonists of this system of government, such states, their representatives, their property, and their organizations should not be afforded any more protection under our laws than is given to the National City Bank of New York in the laws applicable to the city of Moscow, or the American Telephone and Telegraph Company in the laws which apply in Budapest. For a long time, the communist states have treated even the most innocent business enterprise and social club on our side as though they were attainted with an inherent factor of criminal and subversive intent. The withdrawal of U.S. legal protection from all things communist might allow the American people, or those among them who so chose, to develop proclivities for adventure and troublemaking against the communists. These proclivities are now sternly repressed by federal statute. The future of psychological warfare. Psy-war has become an existing art. Where it had no practitioners at all in the United States between 1919 and 1940, it has had a long and distinguished roster of active and reserve officers, civilian consultants, and demobilized veterans interested in the field ever since 1945. A wide variety of military establishments have had psy-war responsibilities assigned them. Substantial cadres of officers and skilled enlisted personnel have been recruited and trained. Radio and leaflet facilities are ready to accompany our land, sea, and air forces wherever they may have to go. A U.S. strategic center for global propaganda, instantly convertible to wartime use, exists in the Operations Coordinating Board under the National Security Council. This is not the end of the story. One of the paradoxical but deeply true factors in the study and conduct of propaganda is this: the more people know about propaganda, the better they can resist it. Propaganda was a tremendous bogey in the 1920s. It probably seems very ugly and frightening to most people born before 1920. It does not seem too frightening, so far as the author can judge, to Americans born after 1930. Those born in the period 1920 to 30 appear to be divided in their emotional reactions to mass persuasion situations. Psy-war is not magic. It is a valuable auxiliary to modern warfare and a useful concomitant to modern strategy. If a particular strategic policy is sanely and effectively devised as a feasible deterrent to war, the psy-war procedures supporting that strategy will contribute to the prevention of war. Psychological warfare represents a recognition and acceptance in the military and strategic field of skills which grow about us every day. Insofar as ultra-destructive weapons may have increased the tenseness and bad temper of people who must live under the perpetual but remote threat of atomic bombing, one can say that physicists have upset the nerves of mankind, and that it is now up to the propagandists to reassure and to reconcile the peoples. Whatever psy-war does, it certainly does not and should not increase the bitterness of war. Fighting itself is the supreme bitterness. Radio broadcasts and leaflets, even in wartime, only rarely should promote hatred. The situation which the world faces is dangerous because of technological development, not because of psychological knowledge. Psy-war ranks as a weapon, but it is almost certainly the most humane of all weapons. Apart from psy-war, what military weapon destroys the enemy soldier's capacity to fight by saving his life? Psy-war tries to bring him over alive and tries to send him home as our friend. No rival weapon can do this. Psy-war, no matter what it may be called in the future, cannot be omitted from the arsenal of modern war. Neither can it outlast war. Its improvement is a cheap, valuable, and humane way of increasing the military potential of any country, whether we think that country to be politically right or politically wrong. Since 1945, we Americans have written more, studied more, and talked more about psy-war than have any of the other free peoples. This is a hopeful sign. It can be read as an indication that the American love of the gadget, the American quest for a novelty, can be turned to the arena of the soul. The communists are better liars, better schemers, better murderers than we shall ever be. They start off by being better fanatics. Is it not in the American spirit that we should out-trick them, out-talk them, and outmaneuver them? We have a very creative and resourceful civilization at our backs. We have no Führer to guide us and no party line to comfort us. We don't even want such things. Hard though it may be, we can live with our own consciences and not seek for keepers. The communists have started a fight with us. That fight may go on a long time. If they want to stop fighting, we shall certainly try to find peace with them. But if they push the fight to its bitter end, we shall not fail.
This concludes Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. We hope you've enjoyed this volume. For more military history audiobooks, subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.